Right then, thank you. Welcome to this Electricity North West Regional Energy Strategic Plan webinar today. We had over 150 people registered for the event, which is why we've just given a little bit of time for people to be accepted from the lobby before kicking off. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Helen Norris. I'm the Stakeholder Engagement Manager at Electricity North West. And we're delighted for you to join us today and for our speakers to be able to take us through what the Regional Energy Strategic Plan means for us in the North West region. We are filming the event so that we can put it online later. We'll be doing that up until question time. So your continued attendance on the call means that you're happy for that to continue. Although in reality, we're asking all participants, apart from the speakers, to mute their microphones and to take their cameras off as well. Thank you very much to those of you who filled in the pre-webinar questionnaire and sent in questions. There is an opportunity for a Q&A session at the end, so please continue to put any questions on chat, and we can pick that up, time allowing, at the end. Hopefully none of us will have any tech issues today, but if you do, I'd suggest you try leaving and rejoining, and then if not, try contacting us on chat and we will try and solve the issue from behind the scenes. But other than that, it's my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce the speakers that we have got today. We're going to kick off with my boss, with the Strategy and Growth Director at Electricity North West, Ben Grunfeld, who'll give us a brief introduction to the Regional Energy System Plan. We're then absolutely delighted that we've got James Johnson, who's the Head of Regional Programmes at the North West Net Zero Hub. James will be able to give us a little bit more detail about RESP and what it means for the region. And obviously one of the key things about RESP is it's about a whole system energy plan, and therefore we're delighted that we've got Dan Heller representing our gas colleagues from Cadent, and then Alison Scott, our Regulation Manager at Electricity North West, who'll be able to give us a little bit more information about the actual consultation process that is in train at the moment, the closing dates, and some insight into what the ENW position is on that as well. So, conscious of time and without any further ado, I'll take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us. I'll come back and do the Q&A session later and introduce Ben.
Thank you, Helen. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We've got, I think, what will be a very interesting agenda and set of presentations to share with you. I think we've got a large number of Northwest and national stakeholders with us this morning, so we certainly appreciate you taking the time to join us, and hopefully this will be informative and helpful for you as you think about the upcoming consultation that Ofgem has launched with respect to the Regional Energy Strategic Plan, which you can see up on the screen. I won't spend, we're going to try as best as we can this morning to avoid a lot of the industry jargon that you often hear when it comes to the electricity sector and regulatory proceedings and plans and all that wonderful stuff. But you will hear one acronym quite frequently as we go through this. You'll probably hear a few, but one in particular, the RESP. The RESP, the Regional Energy Strategic Plan, has evolved quite a bit in terms of what it is meant to be or what is intended to be over the last several months. It has, I think, now quite helpfully, starting to crystallize and formalize. And as you'll see as we go through the consultation material and the preparations for it and share some of the background and context, there is a fair amount of substance now forming behind what was initially a somewhat nebulous concept. But ultimately, the regional energy strategic plan, refers to what will be, hopefully in our intention, a locally led, place-based regional energy outlook and plan for how the energy needs of different regions across the GB will be met. It is intended to support the coordinated development of the energy systems. That's electricity distribution, gas distribution, and others, and to enable long-term investments to be made with confidence and ultimately at pace or ahead of need so that they are not the blockers to net zero. We talk a lot about unprecedented change and unprecedented times in the energy sector. We are at, though, the cusp of something we think quite substantial and quite different. We have a new government in Westminster. Labour conference taking place as we speak, or over the last couple of days in Liverpool. Bold ambitions around the drive for net zero and the pace with which we want to achieve net zero, strong targets around clean power by 2030. This bold ambition isn't necessarily new to the Northwest. The Northwest, whether that is in the Greater Manchester region or even up in Cumbria and in Lancashire, have had ambitious net zero targets for some time. And have been working quite diligently to pursue those and put in place the necessary steps to achieve them. But the additional focus and emphasis from Westminster on net zero and the additional provisions that are being considered will drive change in terms of how those ambitions are achieved and delivered ultimately over the next 5 to 15 years. Here at Electricity Northwest, our vision is to lead the Northwest to net zero. We don't say that lightly. The climate challenge is one of the greatest challenges of our age, and distribution networks, are uniquely positioned to enable that challenge. Our chief executive was at the Labour Party conference yesterday on a panel with fellow leaders from across the ENA. He talked about the 4 Ds of the energy transition, and how distribution utilities in particular embody those 4 elements. And I think that's critical and crucial to what we're going to talk about more today. This session is about sharing information. It's about providing context, and it's about helping you as our stakeholders respond to the Ofgem consultation. We'll get into the detail around what the RESP is, what is being discussed, what is being considered, how you can engage, and how you can participate in that process. But before we do that, we wanted to give a little bit more context around how the RESP sits within the broader energy planning landscape. And my colleagues and fellow presenters will talk about this in more detail as we go through, but I just wanted to provide sort of the high-level overview as a starting point. So there are, in effect, 3 new-ish instruments that are being developed. The NESO, which you'll hear us talk about a fair bit over this presentation this morning as well, the National Energy System Operator, is responsible for ultimately responsible for developing these instruments. One is the Centralized Strategic Network Plan. The second is the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan. And the third is the Regional Energy Strategic Plan. Lots of letters, lots of the usual alphabet soup that you get when you come to an energy webinar. But let me talk a little bit about what each of those does and how they fit together. So if we start from the left and we move to the right, you can think about it in terms of wider to narrower, or from the right to the left, narrower to wider. So the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan will set out a coordinated approach for onshore and offshore energy infrastructure and how we will achieve the grid connectivity required to deliver net zero. The centralized strategic network plan will then look at that strategic spatial energy plan and identify the transmission infrastructure that's required to connect those energy resources and ultimately deliver energy from sources of demand or sources of supply to locations of demand from a GB perspective. The regional energy plan, the regional energy strategic plan, fits within that context by looking at the local and regional implications. And also, this is the plan that truly picks up the distribution networks. How do we connect from transmission infrastructure through to distribution infrastructure to meet the needs of the regional energy demands, And it's the three of these working in concert that ultimately will outline the blueprint for how GB will achieve net zero. And it's important that the three are synced and are aligned in terms of key underlying assumptions, that they are synced and aligned in terms of direction of travel, and that they're ultimately synced and aligned in terms of major policy direction. So this webinar in particular is focused on the RESP. Ofgem has initiated a consultation process to gather input from stakeholders. Electricity Northwest will be participating. We've been participating all along, and we will continue to provide and submit information as part of that process. But one of the things that we heard quite clearly from a lot of our stakeholder engagement over the past several years is that our stakeholders are often challenged for time to fully engage with some of the wider consultations that are taking place. And so this webinar is really meant to help share our knowledge about the process and the underlying issues. We do not have the answers, nor do we propose to necessarily nor do we have the intention to put words into your mouths in terms of your responses to Ofgem, but we want to make sure that you have the fundamental underlying information to be able to then participate. It will give you an opportunity throughout this presentation, and in particular at the end, to ask questions, to clarify aspects of the consultation. The Regional Energy Strategic Plan consultation process, effectively started back in April of 2022. It's evolved over the last several years, and we are now at the point where we're getting to the real, difficult decisions, or the real impactful decisions around the future of the RESP and what it will entail. So there are consultations on the impact assessment this coming autumn. We anticipate a decision on that in late 2024, early 25. And then ultimately the RESP and the decision will move into implementation by late 2025, with the inputs or the outputs, quite frankly, from the first round of regional energy strategic plans to be available to help support business planning, in particular for the electricity distribution companies, as we prepare for the next regulatory submissions. The consultation, we don't have a deep dive to go into every aspect of the Ofgem proposals, as I mentioned. So instead, this is really to signal to you potential areas of interest for your organization. Some areas will be of more interest to others. There's three key areas where Ofgem is seeking input: the building blocks of the RESP, the strategic board and the governance around the RESP, and the boundaries of each of the RESPs. The boundaries in particular, and Alison will talk a bit more about this a bit later, they've evolved. What's being proposed now is Ofgem's sort of ultimate minded to position, but there is still opportunity to influence and shape those elements, these three elements in particular. Our speakers are going to talk through the components that are most appropriate and most impactful for them. And then Alison is going to wrap up on the overall process as well and share more information on how to get involved. So with that, I will stop, and I'm very, very pleased to hand it over to James Johnson from the Northwest Net Zero Hub, who's going to talk about RESP and the impact on regional planning. Thank you. James, over to you.
Thank you. Hello all, pleasure to be here today. Hope you can hear me okay. Yep, I've been invited to speak a bit about sort of RESPs in the Northwest context. I am going to control these slides and try not to fumble it. The Net Zero Northwest Hub is funded by the Department of Energy, and we're here to help local government in the Northwest with its net zero ambitions, particularly driving investment into projects and enabling activities around that, thinking about the heat decarbonisation strategies and power plans of local government, but that means working with communities and businesses as well. So we cover the Northwest geography, and it's neat that that is the geography the RESP may take as the boundary recommendation currently stands. The Northwest of England isn't a political geography, but it is a recognised region of the UK, internationally defined recognised region of the UK, with a long history of collaborating. And previously we've had regional bodies covering the area. So we look at the Northwest through the lens of the counties, combined authority areas, the tier 1 authorities, and we're steered as an organisation by those combined authorities, and at the moment the enterprise boards, which have grown out of the local enterprise partnerships. But there's an evolving picture here of devolution, where government is looking for regions to move to a combined authority model and therefore take more powers and funding onto themselves, but it's moving at different tracks at different times. So we've got the combined authorities in Greater Manchester and Liverpool City region, with an evolving picture in other parts. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the geography of the region and the stakeholders that are going to be relevant to the RESP. I'm going to touch on local area energy plans, which are named in the RESP consultations being documents that local authorities might want to submit as their evidence of future need, but we don't have those everywhere in place at the moment. I'll say a little bit about that. I'll reflect on the RESP and NESO role, and then draw some comments on the RESP consultation from the point of view of local government stakeholders to draw out a few threads. We've been in listening mode on the RESP consultation, and I'll finish with a few observations. We are not responding to the consultation. We're a creature of the Department of Energy, so we don't respond to consultations, but we are gathering in views, and like ENWL, if you pass any of those to us, we're going to aggregate them up and put them into the net zero team within government. So a little bit about the geography. You know, the RESP is saying that it's the top tier authorities that will form the stakeholder group to be consulted. That does beg a question, because there's lots of lower tier authorities in the region. In the combined authority areas, there's 16 distinct metropolitan councils, there's 7 unitary authorities, and there's 13 lower tier authorities under the Lancashire County Council. So quite a complicated political geography to consult in the creation of a RESP. And there's of course the 2 DNO licence areas, Scottish Power Energy Networks and Electricity Northwest, and 2 gas licence areas, Cadent here today, speaking later, and also Northern Gas at the top of Cumbria. So those of us deeply enmeshed in sort of net zero and energy have been thinking about this policy area for a while. But I guess the concern has been that that's only visible to those of us paying attention, and for lots of organisations, this is coming quite quickly down the tracks and is quite transformative. We have a working group that discusses, what the region needs. We want to be ready for RESP and able to speak about collaboration opportunities and mutual advantage, respecting that different organisations will have different drivers and needs. But we're working with combined authorities, local authorities. Now, some local authorities in the Northwest have done local air energy plans, and their experience is going to be very relevant to the RESP operation. We're also talking to Mersey Tidal Power and the British Hydro Association about offshore and onshore aspects, because the energy system goes beyond the energy network. And what I think is challenging with whole place planning is thinking about other aspects of the environment that play into those systems. And local government does participate with the DNOs in the region, sitting on their sustainability and environment panels, and the DNOs also have these roles as distribution system operators, where they're managing the flexibility of the system. We also participated. Cadent have recently published a hydrogen vision, and I'm sure we'll hear more about their long-term plans for the gas network today. But when you delve into this, you see just how many stakeholders there are. So the Energy Systems Catapult is a arm's length organisation separate from the government, but it has produced guidance recommending how local areas should think about energy planning, and it maps out any number of stakeholders that ought to be considered as part of the process, because you need to consult your networks, but you also need to consult your community, your businesses, industry. And I think the rest begs the question about how all those different views are kind of bottled up into a strategic board that's going to speak for the region. In local government, for a long time, we've been developing decarbonisation pathways. This is a broad term we come to use to mean policy and planning. So maybe a local area energy plan, but equally it could be an energy strategy that's looking at the sectors of an economy. It could be the carbon plan of local government itself. It could be the pipeline of investment that local government is trying to support, be it in heat networks or solar farms, working to invite developers in, or sometimes making planning considerations and managing opponents of those systems. So local government is enmeshed in the energy system in different ways, has created a range of different carbon descent pathways and policy frameworks. The idea of a LEAP has come into the frame as a method that's recommended. It doesn't have a formal status with the Department of Energy yet. They understand that the areas are developing them and are supportive of that idea, but they don't provide funding to local government to do them at this stage. Ofgem, though, has recognised LEAPs in as a language when it's set out the RIIO-2 framework, because it wants the DNOs to consult with areas where those exist. So I think we need to rapidly move to a position where local areas have a grasp of their future energy scenarios, and the question is whether they need to go into the depth of a LEAP or not. We've also got the sectoral plans of local economies. Local growth plans are being reiterated under the new government, and we've worked in the Northwest on a cluster plan centred in Cheshire around hydrogen production for the major industry and chimneys around there. We've asked ourselves the question, how far can that extend into the rest of the geography, and how quickly? So local government does need to contend with the energy system. Why might we do a local air energy plan, which is time consuming and resource intensive? Well, it will want to set its own policy targets. Lots of parts of the Northwest have declared climate emergencies at the political level. I think every district. And so they may have a very high level strategic target, net zero by 2030, net zero by 2040. Then having set out policy, they want to help attract investment into those ideas and maybe invest themselves with their devolved and strategic funding. They may want to encourage private investment to come in by recognising, we need tens of thousands of heat pumps in our region. Let's make sure that some of that's being manufactured in the Northwest. Lancashire is supporting the manufacture of heat pumps at the moment, because we know this is a freight train of transition coming and we need to adapt to it. The DNOs, the GNOs, come to local government and ask, when they're doing their network planning at the moment, what are the important developments that we need to factor into our planning? Growth in housing or regeneration projects. They also need to see where local governments are retrofitting properties and social landlords are. So that dialogue is already happening. But we need to enrich that now. I want to understand where we might have major infrastructure in our local areas that's politically supported, and make sure that that is factored into the RESP, so it's factored into national planning considerations, because there's only so much resource for investment in the major networks, and each region might be, want to be quite competitive about that. Transport infrastructure and EV charging accelerating at pace. So I think it's important that in setting out area energy plans, these are the reasons why we might do them, but we also importantly want to consult with our communities. That's an important part of the LEAP methodology. And in order to do that, you need time, and you need to do that, meaningfully, cover your population. Greater Manchester Combined Authority, one of the first to go on the local area energy planning path, so it set the pace for a lot of the rest of the country, has developed a LEAP for each of its districts, and did a good job of engaging communities on the proposals and gave them tools to think about what their domestic energy options might be. And looking at it the other way around, the DNO in its DSO role wants to work with local government on the ability to be more flexible about investment and put assets on the grid that can be switched on and off, so that we don't need to reinforce the network more than we need to. And that is again a process that involves local government in naming important sites of development. They might not be fully in planning yet, but if we can look at them in advance, invest ahead of need, we can invite auction for developers to come in and provide a service onto the grid. So that allows the network to reopen its plans. The rest will have to contend with that process that's already in place, and allow the flexibility for it to happen. As the hub, we're very interested in the public estate, and so the public estate is leading by example on heat decarbonisation. The hub runs a programme to support local government in the region on this, and you realise just how difficult it is to do that street by street, building by building level heat decarbonisation, because we've got to, in some cases, a heat pump of commercial scale is going to have a grid implication that needs to be factored in. So that dialogue is bottom up and needs to happen everywhere. And we also work with communities on their ambitions, and the government's manifesto makes a case for community investment in net zero, and we support a funding programme to think about the feasibility of these schemes. Often it's the grid, the cost of connection, albeit that that's now socialised, the timescales for the connection that holds back some of the ambition of these projects. And so how do we bring the community scale projects into the view of the DNO? Can it go down to that granularity? So we've heard about the National Energy System Operator and the Strategic Spatial Plan. I don't know if people are aware that the Great Grid Upgrade is something announced by National Grid, and there's an idea of shortening the time for the expansion of the transmission network. which means marching, pylons across part of the country potentially, and cannot move fast enough in order to bring in all the offshore wind that is to be developed by 2030. So although as local government we're not often contending with the transmission network, and the RESP is concerned with the DNOs, these pieces of infrastructure are going to be built out around us. We've got a lot of offshore wind in the Irish Sea, and proposal for major tidal power infrastructure on the coast. It's important that local government contends with the need for the RESP to articulate where we might need transmission to move faster. And there are proposals in the transmission plans to upgrade parts of our network, but they're not as highly prioritised as some of the upgrades in other parts of the country. So it's important that strategically we speak with one voice about the need for these infrastructure to be unlocked. There's a recent consultation on the expansion of the Mersey Ring. I mentioned already the hydrogen carbon capture proposal out of the Northwest Cluster Plan, and we looked at that not just as an asset to develop hydrogen, but also how you take industry on the journey to decarbonisation, which means a lot of investment behind the meter to make processes more efficient. So that is a need, but it's not one that presently has a sort of funding regime to go business to business to help them change their processes and avoid the need to decarbonise. So sectorally, and there'll be other examples like the decarbonisation of the housing stock, there's a lot of ambition to reduce the demand for energy articulated in long-term policies. When the networks plan, they do it on a 5-year cycle, and they look at the future energy scenario and take a reasonable guess as to how quickly that can move. It might not move that fast in some places, it might move faster in others. So bringing the local knowledge to bear is going to be really vital. Heat zones are another major novelty that we have to contend with. The energy bill last year has made it possible to zone areas where there's a high intensity of heat and find it economically desirable that be on a heat network rather than individually heated. Well, that we're only just at the beginning of the conversation with some areas about whether they want to go into those heat zones where they can start asking anchor buildings to connect, and therefore that's going to have a big grid implication. It might take 10 or 15 years to build that out. We need that evidenced early. And I think I've mentioned already the political targets, that local devolved city regions will want to direct some of their funding to going faster than the government wants to on net zero. So I think the wiring diagram for local energy plans at the moment in the guidance doesn't mention the NESO because it wasn't there when the guidance was written, and we need to rethink quite rapidly how all the stakeholders work. If you read the consultation, it's saying that the NESO, the RESP, will give tools to local agencies to help them think about this, and what remains to be seen is the extent of that. The idea being there'll be technical advice, a knowledge bank, training so that stakeholders understand the energy system better, and working groups to collaborate on problems, common tools for data consistency, but not explicitly funding those local projects to do energy plans themselves. That's not what's being proposed here. So tools maybe design help, but if local areas want to develop a deep local area energy plan, they're going to have to find the resources themselves, or it's going to have to come from somewhere else. So we're in listening mode as the hub. We're listening particularly to local government, but we're interested in the views of other actors. I think though today we've got a consultation opportunity here, and if we give our feedback to NWL, they can reflect that. I think the framework to support and enable local government to participate in strategic planning is what's proposed in the consultation response. And I think, I'm talking to a wide audience here today, and I may be being a bit focused on the local government side of things, but it's important, I think, if we respond to consultation, you don't need to respond to every single question in a consultation, but you might have very strong views about a question in particular, and that the more feedback Ofgem get on this subject, the more likely the outcome will be the one that we want. Local government data that's being asked for is complicated. Those local air energy plans, local plans, your transport plans, your net zero targets, housing stock data and heat network zoning data, as well as the plans for an investment. I work for lots of local government or authorities, and there's not many that have all that information in an orderly fashion ready to pass across the table to the RESP. So how do we get our house in order before we hit the date when we're asked? And how do we avoid that being very high cost and resource intensive activity? So some of the things we've heard from people we've been discussing the consultation with, and there's a lot to say about this, but how are local policy targets for net zero going to interact with national net zero legislation? Lots of the Northwest wants to move quicker than 2050, and it says in the consultation that will be factored into decisions, but that the top-down recommendation will be based on national policy. So those two things will have to interact. We've got certainty in some development. If a developer wants to develop a new site or a energy asset, that's going to be in planning. The DNO can see it, they'll have submitted licenses, but the 5, 10, 15-year growth plans of areas, they're more nebulous. They might be the highest priority for an area, a metropolitan area, to redevelop its town centre, but how much certainty can be applied to that? And then the consultation does ask that question: how will stuff be validated? There's also this idea that lower tier authorities will need to be, in the LEAP guidance, it recommends it's lower tier authorities with the sort of local political capital that ought to consult with their stakeholders, whether or not the upper tier authority is the one that sort of manages the development of the LEAP. So it's important that areas are joined up, and I can think of several areas where the net zero target for the upper tier authority is not the same as the one for the lower tier authority. We've relied in the past on the future energy scenarios, the DFES scenarios of the DNOs, and they are now going to interact with the RESP as well. So there's a question there about how that will flow. And we've got 4 different license areas in the Northwest. They've made their own network plans. The idea there is going to be common assumptions, even around, how much heat, how many heat networks, how quickly, how many heat pumps, how quickly. I think that's going to be a challenge for some very sophisticated modelling done by those teams. Will that have to all be reworked? And I think there's more stakeholders than currently named as potential members of the strategic boards. You can't have the board to be too large, but we need it to be representative of a wide range of stakeholders. And I've said before, how will the community views be bottled up to the top for community consultation? Our contact details are on these slides, and I believe they'll be shared after the event. Hopefully that was interesting. Not sure quite how I've stuck to time, if I have, but I'll pass over now to the next speaker.
I think we're going to take an opportunity here. Oh, Helen, you're there. I'll let you take the lead.
Thanks, James. We've got Rory on the phone on the call from GMCA, and I was just wondering, Rory, whether you wanted to pop in and just have a minute or two just discussing your experiences, because as GMCA you've been tracking the development of the regional energy strategic plan quite closely.
Yeah, absolutely, Helen. Happy to chip in a little bit. So yeah, I'm Rory Matthews. I'm a Senior Policy and Partnerships Officer at Greater Manchester Combined Authority. I work in the low carbon team, so I very much come at this from that decarbonisation perspective. Yeah, we've been working quite closely trying to support and sort of Ofgem on the development of this, because we see it as a really sort of fundamental, I guess, opportunity to try and help deliver some of our local area energy plans that have been developed, and to reflect some of that regional thinking and ambition that is feeding into decarbonisation, sort of ahead of the net zero goal of 2050 nationally. So we provided a high-level consultation response initially last year, sort of in support of the principle of the RESPs, and we've been engaging with the workshop since. As James kindly mentioned, it was before my time at GMCA, but we've got local area energy plans for each of the 10 local authorities here, and sort of really view those as an important aspect in terms of sort of developing that bottom-up approach to decarbonisation and where things need to happen and when by. Yeah, I guess from our perspective, there's a few sort of key points that we want to emphasise. We're going to put a consultation response in, and we're just working sort of up a draft to sign off internally alongside our place directorate, and we'll be circulating that to our constituent local authorities in the next week or so. I think I saw a few names I recognised on the call, so hopefully that's helpful for those and plays into it. But I think, like James said, we're very supportive of the split to northwest. They were proposing a RESP region for the whole of the north, which we viewed as probably too large, and yeah, breaking that down into the northwest for us seems to make a lot of sense. I think for this to be successful, accountability is a really key with this sort of new formation and the RESP coming into place. For us, you know, it needs to be crystal clear as to, you know, who is responsible for what in developing LAPEs or feeding in the data, or, you know, taking accountability from whatever comes out of the plans. And I guess crucial to that is we want to see some increased detail on integration with other supportive plans, in particular, you know, local development plans, spatial development strategies, providing that bottom-up input, as James had on one of the slides, and really making sure that those are accounted for, and that whatever the RESP does, it aligns with those sort of growth ambitions and local plans that are occurring and you know, are vital to us as local government. And there's perhaps a risk that the strategic board gets quite inflated and big, and I think with those sort of structures you need that knowledge continuity, and for us at the moment there's a bit of an assumption from Ofgem that local authorities will just participate because of that opportunity, and that perhaps, you know, some sort of resourcing is needed, as well as that value to the local authorities from participating by aligning with those local development plans that exist, so that there's that clear benefit and alignment alongside the decarbonisation aspect. And just the final point I want to make is that this is obviously quite a rapidly changing landscape at the moment, with GB Energy coming through and the local power plans that have already been mentioned. And I think that going ahead, we sort of want to keep a keen eye on how, you know, as a local actor, that might influence things and how that will tie into the RESP too. So those are some sort of the high level thoughts that we're going to be feeding in. I hope that's helpful, and more than happy to chip in if there's any specific questions on our involvement too.
Thanks, Rory. I know we've got Todd Holden on the line as well, who's also been involved previously, GMCA and now independent. Todd, was there anything that you particularly wanted to add to Rory's observations there? Because I know you've been particularly involved as well, and we've got probably about a minute or two that we can give you if you wanted to say anything.
Thank you. I think as Ben touched on, we're moving from a situation where the energy network was a predict and provide to a plan and provide. And that means plans are a lot more important and will carry a lot more weight regionally and nationally than they previously may have done. But we know that not all plans are equal, and they vary in terms of the quality and comprehensiveness. Some are very good, some are more like wish lists. The RESP will effectively follow the future energy scenario, which is the national target to be net zero by 2050, and that will be the default position. So unless local areas have got plans in place that are credible enough to influence the RESP, a 2050 net zero target will effectively be imposed on them. And that means there's a very narrow window between probably now and maybe early 2026 to get a planning document and framework in place that is able to influence that RESP process, because RESPs are only updated every 3 years. So if we miss the opportunity to influence the first RESP, it will be 3 more years before that opportunity arises again. And that's particularly important because it's looking at the moment is that the RESP will set the direction of travel for the DNO, the DNO's business plan, which is between 2028 and 2033. So effectively, if we miss the window for the first iteration of the RESP, then that won't be factored in necessarily into Electricity North West thinking, at least at the early stages of its next business plan cycle. So that's a very long-winded way of saying we've got a very narrow opportunity to get our house in order and make sure that we can create the influence we need to within the strategic board and wider to make sure that our political ambitions for being net zero before 2050 are actually realised through the investment that Electricity North West is able to do into the network. That was all I really wanted to say, Helen, so thank you. I think you're on mute.
I know. Thanks for that. Thanks so much for Todd, Rory and James for that intro as well. Don't forget, if you've got any questions, you can pop them into the chat and we'll pick them up at the end. It would be remiss of us not to recognise that this is a whole energy system plan. So I'd like him to introduce Dan to come and present the gas perspective for us.
Thank you very much, Helen. Good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be able to join Electricity North West and yourselves in discussing RESP and the implications, what this can have going forward on the North West region. So just to introduce myself, I'm Dan Heller. I am Cadence Net Zero Analytics and Insights Manager, and I sit within our Investment and Future Energy department. As Todd's just mentioned here, challenges which may face Electricity North West in their next price control from 2028 is something which is already becoming quite a concern for us as it stands at the moment, because we're actually going into our own price control ready for 2026, and gas networks and electricity networks don't follow the same pattern or 5-year planning cycle. We both operate to 5-year cycles, but they are not aligned. So what I want to try and share is just an overview of what the gas network currently does, what it provides. You might all not know what Cadent do and provide, our role in the UK energy sector, our ambitions of where we see things going and the challenges which need to be overcome to be able to decarbonise the energy sector, and ultimately where do we see RESP going, or what does RESP really need to take into account to be able to deliver robust, credible energy plans for the future. So Cadent Gas is the UK's largest gas network. We consist of over 130,000 kilometres of gas pipe, and we stretch from Southend-on-Sea in Essex right to Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria. In total, each year we transport roughly, and this is just Cadent alone, not the entire gas network, transport 253 terawatt hours of energy across our 5 operational networks. If you put this into equivalent to the electricity demand last year, the entire UK electricity network transported around 266 terawatt hours of energy. So it puts in perspective literally how much energy is transported through the gas networks every year in comparison to current electricity needs. In addition to obviously maintaining the network, we also operate the UK's Gas Emergency Centre and also deal with all gas emergency responses to the 12 million customers we serve across our area, ensuring that we keep them safe and warm 365 days a year. So what about the UK gas network and the challenges which will face the future? It's been around for over 200 years and is at the moment the backbone to the UK energy sector. We provide 2/3 of all of the UK's energy every year, and Cadent alone provides 50% of that. We ensure that UK continues to get the energy when the sun doesn't shine and when the wind doesn't blow. And as we transition to a net zero future, we see Cadent picking up 3 important roles to address the challenges the UK will face in decarbonising the energy system. The first one of these will be converting and developing the gas network, making it ready to support the changing demands of the UK, driving emission reductions to ensure we minimise the emissions of the network whilst consumers still need gas, and enabling energy solutions through innovation and new low carbon energy sources such as biomethane and hydrogen. As we plan for the future, though, we have to address the challenges that are not experienced by other utilities. The gas network is highly interconnected. As I mentioned, it's been built up over centuries of evolution, ensuring the demands of our customers are continually met. And we need to take into account that to deliver the same amount of energy as 1 metre of gas pipe, you need 15 metres of electricity cables. To put this in comparison, just for our network alone, that's equivalent to 2 million kilometres of additional cabling to deliver the same energy needs which we currently provide every year, and in order to keep customers warm in the peak of winter. Gas networks provide typically 5 times the energy compared to electricity networks to the typical home on a cold day. So we need to ensure that RESP reflects this in every plans. We need to make sure, and it was touched on previously by James, Rory and Todd, that plans for the future need to be credible. There is going to be more of a reliance on planning, and we need to make sure that the deliverables which are in those plans can be achieved. We operate to a 99.99% reliability, and one of the things which RESP needs to make sure that it can do going forward is any plans for energy transition going forward, that we continue to provide our customers, whether it be businesses, industry or consumers, the same level of reliability and standards that they have with the current energy solutions for electricity and gas networks. We'll need to overcome significant uncertainty and ensure our consumers still receive the energy they need by the gas network until suitable alternative solution is in place. We have a network which has been here for many, many years, and we envisage that we will still be providing that support to consumers until an alternative solution can be found from, whether that be through electrification, heat networks, biomethane, hydrogen. And we see this demand and this need still going into the 2040s and beyond, whether it's providing methane to hydrogen production sites, power stations, or they're transporting green gas instead. We also know that there's going to be a reduction in customers within the gas network, but we need to make sure that plans are reflective of reality. A reduction in customer numbers doesn't mean a similar percentage reduction in the gas network. Our customers are spread across the breadth of the UK. Cadent alone serves over 37,000 industrial users, who a lot of them require high burning combustible substances to generate the energy and power that they require. These industries are essential to local communities to provide jobs and employment, and we need to make sure that they continue to get the energy they need to be able to support their services and their working practices. So the network will still be required, and it won't be like for like to the number of customers which are retained on the gas network. And some of these customers will also move on to biomethane islands or hydrogen gas supplies, hopefully on a positive decision for the future for the net zero. And in addition to that, we will need to continue to maintain our network. So whilst we're still providing services through the gas network, and whilst we're transitioning to hydrogen and biomethane, we need to still make sure that the network operates safely and reliably. So plans and regional energy system plans in particular need to ensure that the same level of investment is continued to maintain the compliance and policy requirements for operating a safe, resilient network. But it's not all challenges. There are opportunities, and I briefly mentioned a couple of them. We have started our transition to net zero with projects such as our iron mains replacement programme and HyNet in the northwest. And we'll continue this journey with our focus on working with stakeholders such as RESP, NESO and other utilities, as well as local authorities, industries and businesses to deliver the right energy solution for the UK. We will look to understand our asset performance so we can strategically target interventions to reduce emissions sooner through our digital platform for leakage analytics project. All our gas networks are 22 years into a 30-year programme to replace over 95% of the gas pipes in the ground with hydrogen viable PE piping. This will not only reduce the emissions and improve the safety of the network, but will also make the network ready to be able to transport hydrogen if a positive heat decision is passed for heating homes with hydrogen. We have an ambition to provide the equivalent of over 2 million homes of biomethane energy by 2033, which is 16% of our domestic gas demand. This is already live projects which we're looking to reduce the emissions within local authorities and within regions so that we can move people onto green energy sources instead of natural gas. Last year, the government passed a positive decision on hydrogen blending, and Cadent are working with the government now to ensure that we can provide blended hydrogen mix to customers before the end of the decade. We have a reliance as a country on interconnectors with Europe, and they're already progressing hydrogen blending strategies. It's a much further and faster pace than what the UK are. So this could mean that very soon that we'll be getting hydrogen before the end of the decade as a mix for our consumers from Europe. And we're also working on 100% hydrogen projects. We have HyNet in the northwest, our East Coast hydrogen pipeline, and our capital hydrogen project, where we're looking to be able to provide hydrogen, 100% hydrogen pipeline and services to industries within these regions. And again, based on a positive heat decision in 2026, hope to expand that out to be able to provide hydrogen to domestic heating as well as a potential solution, whether it be through blended or as 100%. We see a whole system approach being absolutely essential to deliver the future needs of our customers, but it needs to reflect the energy infrastructure which we have invested in and what DNOs and gas networks are already investing and planning to invest in. But plans need to be deliverable. Solutions need to have credible milestones that reflect the services we provide today in order to, so we don't strand funding or investment and spend consumer money in the wrong way. So finding the right whole system approach to decarbonisation in the energy sector will not be straightforward for NESO and the RESP. Our consumers' needs vary significantly, and making sure all consumers are kept safe and warm is challenging. RESP is really important as it will provide the bottom-up real-world input into energy system strategic planning. It will also inform the transition from a what next approach to strategic planning to a complete end-to-end 2050 conversion plan. If it fails to do this, we will not deliver net zero efficiently in line with our consumer needs. And through only focusing on the next best steps, the next milestone, the next milestone, will only ensure subsequent steps are suboptimal. So RESP must ensure whole system plans reflect the views of the communities and industries we serve. It can't be just directed by this is the desired pathway. Pathways will need to be reflective of the infrastructure in place and clearly show the deliverability of solutions in a way that is understood by all stakeholders, whether it be local authorities, networks, utilities, consumers. RESP also needs to continually assess the pathways and energy vectors to ensure there is consistency across all plans against a national view and set clear timescales so that we can assess whether these pathways still remain achievable. Uncertainties need to be clearly defined and signposted and documented so that everybody can understand what is actually being applied and what assumptions are being taken into account in the planning process. And there needs to be feedback loops to review the plans as we go forward. And finally, RESP must ensure the right decision is made, even if it means preferred options are refused. So proactive engagement and building supportive and informative links with local authorities, industries and utilities and interested third parties is a must to develop credible regional energy system plans that reflect the network and communities we serve. With that, I'd like to thank you. My contact details are on the slide if anyone wants to get in touch or inquire. And I'd like to now hand over to Alison Scott, Regulation Manager at Electricity North West. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks to everyone that's able to join us this morning. My name's Alison Scott. I'm one of the regulation managers here at Electricity North West, and I've been following the development of the RESP from the initial case for change that Ofgem explored when they looked at DSO activities and local institutions and governance arrangements. But the purpose of this part of today's session is to provide an overview to each of the components of Ofgem's consultation, highlight the areas that might be of particular interest to yourselves, and then to signpost how to get involved from here onwards and have your voice in the shaping the next steps. So as Ben explained at the start of today, Ofgem has laid out a 3-part planning process. And I thought it was important to just touch and recap on this to understand where RESP fits in amongst all of these new phrases and acronyms that we're starting to hear. So as Ben said, all 3 plans are new. They don't exist at the moment, and they're all being delivered by our new National Energy System Operator, the NESO, I'll call from now on, who will formally come into force next week. So all of these plans will coherently interact with each other. And Ofgem government vision is that that 3-part process will allow investment at the right time, at the right place, in order to reach those decarbonisation targets as effective as possible. So the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan is the national plan, which will be commissioned by government shortly, and that will set out a coordinated approach to the energy supply and demand mix that GB will need. That will inform the centralised strategic network plan, which will be a directive blueprint for the transmission infrastructure that will be needed for GB to facilitate that decarbonised grid. Finally, RESP. So that sits at the regional level. It will take its top-down input from the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, but importantly and crucially, it'll be accompanied by a significant amount of bottom-up inputs that will come from local authorities, from networks such as ourselves, and from other local actors. The NESO will take all of those inputs, top-down and bottom-up, and the output will be the RESP. So for those of you that have maybe been involved in the development of the RESP, you might have referred to it as being the regional planner or the system planner. Ofgem clarified that in their recent consultation, that the RESP is a plan, not a body or a role. The NESO is the accountable body, and the responsibility for creating the RESP and these other plans will sit within the strategic planning function of the NESO. And that output, the RESP, will reflect the regional requirements into a whole system strategic energy plan, taking those inputs from the gas networks, the electricity networks, and all of the local actors that feed in the data inputs that James talked about earlier. It's the intent that all actors then take this plan to inform their own plans. So, for example, we as a DNO will take this, we'll build our own network investment plan that enables the RESP pathway. It will meet our regional requirements, and in turn, which should enable Ofgem, our regulator, to be able to set funding allowances for that investment and those plans with confidence. It's envisaged that local government and other local actors will do the same, taking that RESP and shaping and informing their own plans. It will then be an iterative cycle, so the RESP will then inform future iterations of the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan in that feedback loop. Now, as with all reform, the devil's in the detail, which is a phrase I've used a lot when talking about RESP. And this is why this consultation and this point is a key milestone in the development of the RESP. Following the stakeholder input that we're encouraging today, Ofgem will set their policy framework. The NESO will then take that framework away and use it to develop the methodologies to how the RESP will actually be created. And at this point, many of the outstanding questions we've got about how RESP will work in practice will start to be answered. So Ofgem have already made the decision RESP is coming into being and that the NESO will be the body to create it. They've laid out the key characteristics, such as it must be place-based, it must be whole system, and have significant input from local actors. It must have a regional voice. So the next step in the process, as I've just said, is to lay out the proposals for what framework the NESO should take to build the methodology. And so Ofgem's proposals and their questions are around these 3 key areas: the building blocks of what will make up a RESP, modelling supply and demand, setting regional pathways, identifying system needs, and technical coordination. Then Ofgem proposed a governance structure around the RESP. And finally, Ofgem proposed the boundaries, so the number of RESP regions. Before we go into each of those 3 areas in more detail, I want to touch on the guiding principles that Ofgem proposed are used to talk to the NESO and shape their approach on how the RESP methodology is developed. Those are it must be place-based, whole system, vision-led, and proactive. And we agree with all of those principles. There's nothing to disagree with there. Particularly, we support the first two. They perfectly embody what RESP should be about, whole system and place-based. And without those, the RESP won't deliver on its aims in our view. Ofgem are asking for input on these principles. They're not set in stone yet. That's the purpose of the consultation. So in addition to the 4 put forward by Ofgem, we at ENW think there's merit in adding a further 2, and they're at the bottom there: transparency and collaboration, and being consistent with accountabilities. It's essential that any RESP methodology is developed in an open, transparent manner. Given that the RESP will take feeds from national and local input and equally inform those national and local actors, then they need to be involved in developing that methodology. And also being clear on accountabilities. The NESO must be cognizant of the local authority, combined authorities, powers, obligations and accountabilities. The gas and distribution networks have our own core legal and security obligations, and blurring or duplicating any of those accountabilities risks issues, confusion, safety, reliability or inefficiencies. And so any methodology should be developed cognizant of those accountabilities. We now move into the detail of Ofgem's consultation, and I will pause here because there's quite a lot of information to take in on this slide. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the building blocks that Ofgem propose make up the RESP, and on the right-hand side, the data inputs that Ofgem consider would be critical for a RESP development. So taking each of these in turn, and again, this is quite a high-level overview, I would encourage you to look at the detail in the areas that interest you the most. But on modelling supply and demand, Ofgem proposed that the RESP output contains a long-term vision and priorities, a short-term pathway, and when we say short-term, the indication is 5 to 10 years, and then multiple long-term pathways that show that supply and demand. We agree. Here at ENW, but we are clear that a RESP pathway should be minimum whole cost pathway. A pathway is what should happen. That differs to a forecast or a scenario, which is what could happen. Secondly, looking at identifying system need. Consistency of assumptions and methodology is important, but there must be a recognition that regional variations are a key factor that the RESP need to take into account. Informing strategic investment. We think where best value can be added is by whole system planning and design. A good example is recently ENW worked with National Grid Transmission and our system operator to look at requirements where both the distribution and the transmission boundary needed to be reinforced to meet significant connection requirements in the area. And the output of that was a well-justified, built-in-time connection that meant that the connections required were met and the capacity is unlocked for the future. Finally, the third building block that Ofgem proposes around technical coordination. And we see a clear role in the NESO looking to manage gaps and inconsistencies and identify whole system opportunities across gas and network plans, but probably little benefit in doing a full technical evaluation of those plans because we don't want to duplicate the role of Ofgem and their engineering teams, which comes back to being clear on accountabilities and roles. The data inputs, I think James has covered this in quite a bit of detail already, but what I would do is encourage you to take a look at the kind of requirements that is being sought for from local government data and other local data. And questions to ask yourselves, is this readily available? How mature? At what granularity? How is it refreshed, etc. So again, James talked about the place-based engagement and the support. So NESO must talk to local actors in order to collect the intelligence and the data needed to develop the RESP. That engagement should build on the good practices that's been established so far, and Ofgem share 4 principles that should guide that place-based engagement. Transparency, making sure there are clear processes. Accountability, making sure that each actor understands their roles and responsibilities in that process. be representative across the region, including any underrepresented stakeholders, and finally coordinating. Bringing networks and actors together whilst respecting existing relationships is a key component. We often recognise that there might be challenges to local actors to engage in that process, and therefore that package of support that James mentioned is shown on screen. And the type of support might vary by RESP region, depending on the needs of that region and the setup within. Ofgem asks a specific question on that support package, and therefore I would encourage you to look at those proposals in particular, so you can feed in what type of support would best enable you to participate in this process. The rationale being the better local input is, the more effective that the regional output becomes. Moving on to governance. An important element of the successful RESP is the governance structure that surrounds it. And these are Ofgem's proposals at the moment, that a strategic board is created and it is represented by members across democratic accountability, network company representatives, and other cross-sector actors that have a significant input or interest in the output. There's a natural tension between making sure that that board is functional and also representative. And if it does remain at upper tier level, which is the proposal for England, how those processes will take place and how views from the lower tier authorities will be able to be fed in. And then lastly, boundaries. So this is the proposal, and it's been the subject of debate, as Ben, I think, Rory, you mentioned as well. Originally, the proposal was that one RESP would cover the North region. That was recognised as potentially being too large, and therefore a split proposed across the Northwest, Northeast boundary there. Ofgem are asking for views on this, but it's their minded to position at the moment. There is options presented within the consultation, 2 different options, but actually those 2 don't impact the North or the Northwest boundary. We do support having one dedicated RESP for the Northwest. We think it's the right balance. So that's a whistle-stop tour in the consultation. Hopefully it's given you a flavour for what RESP is about and some thoughts on what it might mean to your organisation. We encourage you to take a look at that for yourself. Think about how you want to feed in your views. There's a number of options directly into Ofgem, and we've shared their email on screen and a link to the consultation. Alternatively, feed into James and the Net Zero Hub, or if you're a member of an association or representative body, you can feed that into them as well. Equally, I'm seeing the chat light up, so I think there's a few views and comments going on there as well. Ofgem are continuing to engage, so they have a circulation list, they have periodic webinars and newsletters. So if you want to get involved and be on that mailing list again, you can ask to be involved. And I would expect that probably the next one will be around their decision point post the consultation closing. So thank you all for your attention, and I'll hand over to Helen now to facilitate questions and answers.